In this short video, we are going to take a look at the uh, principle, or maybe the phenomenon, or the process of endocrine disruption. So, if you're unfamiliar with it, you're going to learn something. Hey, all, I have a brief request from this side of the camera. If you've clicked on this video, no matter how long you watch, because not everybody watches videos to their completion, but no matter how long you watch, please smash that like button on the way in. And also, please consider subscribing to the channel. Why would you come to a channel like this? Why would you click on a video like this with a content creator as interesting as me? Why would you not subscribe to the channel? So please consider subscribing. That would help me out a lot. That would help with the engagement. It would help overall. So with that, let's jump in and talk about endocrine disruption, what that is, and why it's important. Well, all, as you can see, I found one of my favorite t-shirts that I haven't worn in a while, my Maize and Blue Michigan Life Sciences t-shirt. So while I was in the latter stages of my doctoral training in the Department of Pharmacology, the university and the medical school set out to build the Life Sciences Institute to study a number of things. I won't get into that now, but this is one of my favorite t-shirts. And so as I have this talk, as I give this particular, as I create this content, I want you to think about not just drugs, but think about industrial chemicals and molecules and waste products of all kinds. So think about this. Let's say, you have a drug plant, a chemical plant, an industrial plant, or a building creating something, and it's giving off wastes, and things are running into the rivers and the streams, and things are leaching into the soil, or maybe a product is produced and it's going into the soil and going into running water or ponds or rivers, whatever. What can happen, and what will happen if humans inadvertently ingest some of those industrial chemicals that are in the water that we don't know? What happens if there are waste products from drug manufacturers that are in the water or the soil, and that go into crops or that go into animals, and you ingest that vegetable matter or that protein, and you don't know that there are other chemicals or products in there? What can happen? What are the potential hazards or negative impacts? I want you to think about that as I go throughout this video. So endocrine disruption, let's talk about endocrine disruption. It's actually a concept that we deal with and we consider at my current 9 to 5. I won't talk about what my current 9 to 5 is now. Maybe sometime in the future, I'll look back on this and I'll talk about it, but I can't talk about what that is right now. But suffice it to say that endocrine disruption is something that we talk about regularly. So for this channel, where did this concept come from? Well, I want to shout out Doug, who is one of my regular viewers, and many of my viewers come from what's called a sector of YouTube called the Black Manosphere. And I want to appreciate, and I want to say that I appreciate all of you from that sector who come over to watch. My goal is to build a channel to have people from all walks of life here. But right now I have a regular crew of people from that sector who come over. One of them is Doug. So I want to shout out Doug for mentioning endocrine disruption in the live stream I did a couple of weeks ago, discussing whether or not men have a biological reproductive clock. And it was actually very pertinent for and timely for Doug to mention that during that live stream, because it's not just a simple thing as to whether or not men have a biological reproductive clock, because there are numerous things that can affect, well, both the reproductive tracts of the male side of the gender line and the female side of the gender line. And as I'll describe, there is the potential for industrial chemicals, once ingested, to impact the reproductive function of both men and women, depending upon the structure of the chemical and how it interacts with different pathways of the body. So let's jump in a little further and talk about endocrine disruption. But first, let's talk about what the endocrine system is. So our bodies are made up of numerous signaling pathways, and there are different classes of signaling pathways. The one we're going to focus on in this video is endocrine signaling. So when you think about endocrine signaling, you want to think about one tissue of the body generating a hormone and then dropping that hormone, or secreting that hormone into the circulatory system, that hormone going into the circulatory system, traveling to another tissue, and then stimulating that tissue to do something. So in this instance, I'm going to focus on the testes. So for the testes, the endocrine signaling actually starts at the anterior pituitary gland. So when we all get to a certain age, assuming we have proper nutrition and we live in safe environments, at some point our sexual and reproductive systems and hormones start to activate. So in men, the anterior pituitary gland gets stimulated, and that releases a hormone called luteinizing hormone. That hormone drops into the bloodstream, and then it travels to the testes. And the Yeah. So when you create this kind of content, you don't realize how complex it is, and you don't realize what details need to go in it until you go through post production. So for accuracy and for completeness, I have to further break this signaling cascade down, and I have to go into a short discussion about the luteinizing hormone and the luteinizing hormone receptor. I thought about this when I was going through post production. So the luteinizing hormone is generated in the anterior pituitary gland. So once again, we're talking about endocrine signaling. So you're dropping a hormone into the bloodstream, and it's going to another tissue somewhere else. So the luteinizing hormone is generated in the anterior pituitary gland. The hormone drops, well, it's secreted into the bloodstream, and it travels to the testes, specifically the Leydig cells. On the outside of those cells, there is a luteinizing hormone receptor. This is a full diagram, a complicated diagram of signaling pathways within the cell. So you have signaling from cell to cell, and then you have signaling pathways within the cells. I'm not going to go over all that. But what I want you to see and understand is that there's a luteinizing hormone receptor on the outside of the Leydig cells. The luteinizing hormone binds that receptor. That sets off a bunch of signaling pathways within the cell, and that ultimately leads to the production of testosterone. Testosterone is generated within the Leydig cells, within the testes. That testosterone is responsible for the male secondary sex characteristics, the growth of muscle, the growth of hair in places where men typically have hair, and also increased amounts of bodily hair, the deepening of the male voice. Testosterone is generated in the testes, and it goes and it affects other tissues or secondary sex tissues. I think that's the proper term for them. But how does it do it? So there's another receptor. So in those cells that are affected by testosterone, there is a nuclear hormone receptor in the cytosol of those cells. The testosterone diffuses into the cell, binds the androgen receptor. The androgen receptor translocates or migrates into the nucleus and then binds the DNA. And that binding of the DNA causes subsequent events to happen regarding the male sexual maturation and sexual homeostasis. And for completeness and in summary, testosterone does a number of things. It regulates a man's sex drive or libido, bone mass, fat distribution, muscle mass and strength, and the production of red blood cells and sperm. As I just read off libido here, I was thinking that I've heard reports that women taking testosterone, when they take testosterone or when they get a higher circulating level of testosterone, I've heard that women, in many instances, take on or they start to experience and feel the sex drive of men. So they get to feel like what it is to be a man in that regard. But those are all the things that testosterone does. Just for completeness, this is a science video, so I want to be thorough and accurate here. So now let's talk about what a negative feedback loop is. So you have a whole cascade of signaling pathways here, or signaling events. The anterior pituitary needs to know at some point when there's enough testosterone floating around so that there's not overstimulation of the testes. And there are dangers to overstimulation of the testes, such as the formation of testicular tumors, which has been shown in lab settings. So how does the anterior pituitary know to stop secreting luteinizing hormone, which will stop the testes from secreting testosterone, or at least it will cause them to create testosterone at a normal level? Let's just call it a normal level. Well, there's something called the negative feedback loop. So there's an androgen receptor in the testes, but there's also an androgen receptor on the anterior pituitary. So with that androgen receptor on or in the anterior pituitary, I haven't seen pictures or diagrams of anterior pituitary cells, but that androgen receptor on the anterior pituitary, once that binds circulating testosterone, the anterior pituitary gland knows, okay, there's enough testosterone floating around in the body. We can shut down production, or we can decrease production so that we reach a steady state level, what we call a steady state level. So what happens if that androgen receptor either goes away, or if something blocks that androgen receptor so that testosterone can't bind it, and so that the anterior pituitary doesn't know that there's enough testosterone in circulation? If something like that happens, if something binds that androgen receptor on the anterior pituitary gland and competes with the testosterone, or if something causes that androgen receptor on the anterior pituitary gland to go away so that testosterone can't bind it, the anterior pituitary gland is not going to know that there's sufficient circulating testosterone in the body. So it's going to continue generating luteinizing hormone. It's going to continue stimulating the testes, and the testes will continue pumping out testosterone, okay, which can have other harmful effects. So what can do that? Well, the concern is that some of the chemicals, some industrial chemicals, waste products from drug manufacturing plants or waste products from chemical plants that create chemicals like pesticides or something else, paints, resins, whatever. The concern is that those chemicals can go into bodies of water, rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, where we humans get our water, or these chemicals can go into the soil. The concern is that these chemicals can get ingested by the crops and the produce that we eat. The concern is that these chemicals can be ingested, by the livestock we consume, the poultry, the beef, the pork, and we can ingest the chemicals. And those chemicals, in this instance, can do things like bind that androgen receptor and interfere with the negative feedback loop involving the testosterone and the anterior pituitary gland. That is an example of endocrine disruption. And that's why Doug brought that up, because there are tons and tons and tons of chemicals that are in our environment. We don't know how many there are. We don't know what they are. And some of them could be interacting. Some of them could be working in concert with each other. And in this instance, a man might be having sexual problems and he wouldn't know why. But it could be because there's a chemical floating around in the water that he's ingested that is interfering with his sexual function. It could be interfering with his endocrine system. So that's the significance of endocrine disruption, and that's what it is. All right, everyone. For completeness, I wanted to circle back and rope in another important player in this pathway, and arguably the most important player in this pathway as it starts this whole series of events. So, and that's the hypothalamus. So both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland are located in our brains. And so the hypothalamus, in this instance, it secretes LHRH, or luteinizing hormone releasing hormone, and CRH, corticotrophin releasing hormone. So in this case, we're talking about testosterone. So that LHRH causes the anterior pituitary gland to secrete the luteinizing hormone. That luteinizing hormone causes the testes to secrete the testosterone. That testosterone affects other tissues, but both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland are subject to the negative feedback loop. So under normal circumstances, once they both sense that there's enough testosterone, they shut down production. And once again, if something interferes with that androgen receptor signaling in both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, there will be elevated testosterone in circulation, elevated levels of testosterone in circulation, which can have harmful effects on the organism, in this instance, a human male. By the way, I started that long, convoluted description of what endocrine disruption is. I hope it made sense. I didn't talk about testosterone or where it comes from. So testosterone is considered an androgen. So I mentioned the androgen receptor, right? So testosterone and estrogen, those are considered quote unquote androgens. The starting material for androgens is cholesterol. So cholesterol, while we need to be careful about ingesting too much through our diet, our body actually makes some cholesterol in the liver. And that cholesterol, some of it is taken and it is converted to testosterone and estrogen and other androgens. So that's testosterone, and that's where it comes from. So testosterone is generated by the conversion of cholesterol to testosterone by the enzyme cytochrome P450 11A1 in the testes in the Leydig cells. So I think I'm going to stop this here. But that's a discussion of endocrine disruption. And I hope someone understood this, and I hope somebody got something out of this. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. I'm hoping that as I go through post-production of this video, I don't need to fix anything, but creating science content like this is not easy. Everything has to be factual. I was just talking to someone about that last night, and everything has to be accurate. So I'm hoping that I just have to edit it and then it'll be fine. So once again, thank you to Doug for raising this concept during that live stream. All right. So once again, let me know what you think if you have any questions or comments in the comment section below. And that live stream is a little further back in my library. Everyone, this is Big Discussions 76, Science and Technology. First of all, please like this video, please share it, and please subscribe to my channel. If you want to donate something to the channel, that information is below in the description box. Please consider joining the Big Words LLC Newsletter. In addition to being a YouTube content creator, I am also a writer with 2 blogs and a book project on the way. All right, everyone, I'm going to conclude this one on my channels. One, I like to think of the saying, knowledge for the sake of knowledge, knowledge for knowledge's sake. So everything here is fair game, especially if it involves science and technology. All right, everyone, as always, remember that your attitude determines your altitude. Always try to do your best. Take care, and I will talk to you the next time. Bye-bye.